Very much looking forward to this conversation. Renaissance Capital economist Charlie Robertson has released a book titled The Time-Traveling Economist, Why Education, Electricity, and Fertility Are Key to Escaping Poverty. His special guest at the book launch was Sterling Bank CEO Abubakar Suleiman, and they talked about a number of economic issues. And joining us now to discuss further is Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, CEO of Sterling Bank. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Really appreciate you coming on the show. You have a degree in economics. You're very passionate about improving the nation on a number of metrics. So I want to get started. Start with the multidimensional poverty numbers. 132 million Nigerians living in multidimensional poverty. How long do you think it will take to reduce those numbers?
Thank you for having me. I've always believed that the speed at which we reduce poverty will be measured by the amount of sacrifices we're willing or we're ready for. If we're not willing to sacrifice any of the things that we enjoy today, especially those that have a better life, then it's much harder to reduce poverty across the country. But I do believe that in the life of one administration, we can have that number. We can easily have that number. And the reason is that the amount of resources required at this initiative is a more prosperous country. And so, yes, timing is down to us. What sacrifices are we willing to make? How transformational are we willing to be in our approach? For instance, are we willing to commit a significant amount of our budget specifically to the rural communities? Say, for instance, 15-20% of national budget will be directed at providing critical infrastructure in the rural communities that enables the average person of decision, that kind of significant deviation from what we do currently, where the vast majority of our resources, that is what it will take.
And when you say the life of an administration, are you looking at 4 years or 8 years?
Oh, no, I think the life of an administration is and always will be 4 years. The second 4 years is never guaranteed, and the sooner we start to think about working within what is I guess, guaranteed when you win an election, I guess the more effective the administration will be.
At the launch of the book launch, you spoke about electricity, education, and fertility. Can we pick one as a top priority to escape poverty, or do all three have to work in tandem?
As Charlie himself insisted, I don't think you can do without any of the three. Anything else, even a sprinter, you need both your legs to run, but you start with your strongest leg. And for me, education will be the strongest of the tripod. It is the foundation because it enables you to provide electricity, right? An educated workforce is far more likely to know how to generate and retain electricity than one that is not educated. But of course, we have sufficient data to prove that for you to manage fertility, it requires an educated population. So I would say, while they are all critical, while all three must happen, if I was to start with one, I would start with education.
And thanks for mentioning education. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, that's UNESCO, says Nigeria now has about 20 million children out of school. That's the population of a number of African nations, like Zambia, for instance. How do we turn that around?
First and foremost, there's a significant issue of deficit of resources. The amount of money we commit to educating people in primary and secondary school is simply not sufficient. Not just for the quality of education that is required so that they can then be very good feeder stock into the tertiary institution as well as into the workspace, but also for the quantity, the sheer population that we have requires us to put more resources there. And at this point, we're not doing enough. So if we want to change that, again, this is one area where we have to decide what is our immediate priority. Do we continue to struggle to fund tertiary institutions, where today about 95% of students who are in tertiary institutions are in government-owned or government-funded tertiary institutions? Or do we begin to look for alternative and sustainable way to fund tertiary institutions and then redirect some of that resources to funding the primary and secondary education? And in so doing, not only do we then take the children off the street, we improve the quality of the education for those who are already in school as well. And more importantly, we create a sustainable and scalable funding mechanism for tertiary education. The thinking is we are carrying a model that worked in 1960. We are carrying a model that was efficient in 1970 when less than 20,000 Nigerians were in tertiary institutions from a population of 57.7 million. Can that model work today when you have over 2 million Nigerians in tertiary institutions? I don't think so. Think about it. The number of people in tertiary institutions has gone up by essentially from what we have today compared to what we had in 1970. That was 1% of today's tertiary education population. Meanwhile, the actual population itself has only grown by. That pace of growth requires us to rethink the funding model. And I don't think we've done that. I think we're simply trying to, in a way, optimize obsolescence. And until we set aside that and think of something fresh that can solve our problem, it's very difficult to deal with the problem squarely and get it done quickly.
Thank you so much. I actually want to get to education funding, but very quickly, speaking of the number of children out of school, what would it take to address our high fertility rates of, I think, approximately 5.2 births per woman, especially in rural areas?
So fertility is a conversation that is a very sensitive one because it's somewhat seen as the flip side of freedom. And therefore, it's one that I'd like to address from a technical perspective. What we know for certain is that when people are given opportunities, when they are educated, when they have an opportunity to participate in the economy, they have fewer children. That's just a fact. And that means that we're not telling people how many children to have. We're simply giving them the quality of life that means that they want to have fewer children themselves. So what are the things that can lead to this? First and foremost, we need to keep children in school. Right. We all agree that children need to be in school because once they drop out of school, they end up living a much lower quality of life than their peers that remain in school. Especially the girl child. We need to keep our girls in school for as long as possible. That's one thing we can do, and nobody will argue with that. I think most people believe that that is a fair recommendation. The second thing we must then do is give people access to learning outside school. Because we assume that education can only happen in the four walls of schools, and that's not true. Increasingly, a lot of education happens outside the four walls of school, and so when you give people access to the internet, for instance, and you give them access to all of the information that is available globally, a lot of self-education also happens. And finally, I also think that even at the point of learning literacy, the home can become part of the educational infrastructure. We need to design content that means that the adult at home start to function in a way as a teacher to help children become literate. And as we increase literacy, we increase access to information globally, I think we can then begin to see the impact on fertility over time. But it is not something that you are going to regulate. I doubt that a democracy like Nigeria would or should even consider the option of that at this point. It's a very difficult thing, but I think people need to be put in a position where they see that it is in their own interest. And of course, if you want people to have fewer children, you need to provide infrastructure for them to give a better quality of life to the children that they have, so that they are not then betting and hoping that the children will live. They have some level of confidence that their children will survive childhood diseases and live to adulthood.
Thank you so much. So now, just to follow up, is this hard? You mentioned it's very difficult. Is it harder in the rural areas? Because these solutions you put forward, can it work both in urban and rural areas as far as trying to reduce the fertility rate?
I think that you would find the fertility rate amongst the urban poor to be much closer to the rural areas than to the urban rich. So in a sense, it's almost a poverty measure rather than just a rural-urban measure. In fact, the urban masses are in somewhat an extension of the rural poor and somewhat an escape from rural poverty. So I like to think of everyone who has not acquired a certain level of education and exposure and who does not have access to primary health care and all of the other social infrastructure as in the same bucket, and they would respond to the same solution to some extent. But of course, it is double whammy for the rural area because they don't even have the opportunity to see what is possible by living in close quarters to those who have then moved out of poverty.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, so back to education, and I think you mentioned this a lot in your prior answer 2 questions ago. Is funding the number one issue for as far as education is concerned?
If we think that government is the one to fund education, or more appropriately, if government is the only one to fund education, then funding is and will remain the issue. We need to be clear about that. Government does not have enough money to fund education for, say, 10 million Nigerians in higher institutions today. My estimation is that we need to have at least 10 million Nigerians, which is about 5% of our population, studying in institutions of higher learning across the country, for us to start to break the back of poverty. Government can't fund that. They're already struggling with 2 million. What we need to think and we need to come to an agreement on is how else can we fund tertiary education? Because if we do that, if we find a solution that says tertiary education is an investment in the individual and that the individual has the capacity and the will to pay back that investment, then maybe we can start to direct resources from tertiary institution, move that into primary and secondary institution where we now face a crisis and we need to declare that a national emergency, and then allow other funding sources to fill the gaps. Not only will they fill the gap of what government is funding today, they are far more scalable because they are commercial in nature, and therefore, rather than just 1% of Nigerian population enjoying the benefit of education at a tertiary level, we could have 5%. And I do believe that Nigerians who are well educated earn enough to be able to pay back the cost of that education.
Thank you, sir. I guess this dovetails into ASU. Is that still, as far as what we've seen with the strikes and so on and so forth, is self-funding for Nigeria's tertiary university, I guess, the way to go, absent government?
I would say that I don't know of any country with 200 million people where the primary funder of tertiary education is government. It's a struggle, right? And so I would say beyond ASU, beyond their debate with government, we need to ask fundamentally, where will the money come from? Because once there is sufficient money, then it's now down to what kind of model. But secondly, in addition to the money, we should ask what kind of empowerment do we want to give the student and their parent? Because again, if you have a model that is funded and the parents and students have no real empowerment, then the quality cannot be assured. They are in fact the consumer. They have to have a say in the quality of education. I think that would engender competition. That's how you increase quality. People being able to vote with their feet, as it were, to say, I'm going to go to that school because I have a really high chance of being employed, or I'm going to avoid that school because the student from there tended not to get employed. We need to do that. And on a final note regarding tertiary education, we need to reconnect the educational institution to the workplace. You cannot have a tertiary education that is, completely disconnected from industry. They end up not being able to take feedback from industry. They end up training people that the industry has to now retrain. So I think we should expand education to involve the workplace as part of the educational process, not in a temporary, partial way like we do with internship. It's got to be much more hands-on and head-on. People who are getting an education to become, for instance, a banker, need to spend far more time in banks than in the classroom, because right now it's about jobs, and you're not going to get jobs from theories.
That's a strong statement, and you're the CEO of one of the biggest banks in the country, so that's a strong statement coming from you there. Sir, we want to take a quick break. Please stick around with us. After the break, we're going to be talking electricity, debt, taxes, and so on. It is, of course, the Arise Global Business Report. We have Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, CEO of Sterling Bank, joining us for a very important talk about the economy. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. We still have, of course, Abubakar Suleiman, CEO of Sterling Bank, with us discussing how Nigeria can escape poverty using electricity, education, fertility. So we talked about poverty, we talked about education, and sir, I want to get to electricity. And of course, this is coming from the time-traveling economist from Rencap, senior economist Charlie Robertson. So electricity, at the book launch, now this was a very interesting discussion around the suggestion that Nigerians don't have cost-effective tariffs being inaccurate. Can you expand on that? I
think the conversation was, how do we fix the marketplace for electricity? one of the experience that we have, and obviously we saw it when we liberalized telecom by licensing the mobile telecom companies, it's that when you allow the market to determine what would be an efficient price for a particular product with some level of guidance from government, you tend to actually reduce the unit cost of that product or that service over time. I keep telling people that I actually paid I believe in 2001 or 2, about 19,000 naira for a SIM card. Today, those SIM cards go for free, right? So the question is, do you start by fixing the price of a commodity before the market has evolved, or do you allow the market to evolve by attracting as much capital as you can? And once you then have the capital locked in, you then work with reducing the price. And the argument is that, from my experience, it's very difficult to attract capital if you start by fixing prices. Right, and so that's the argument for a cost-reflective tariff. The idea is that we need to make investment in the electricity very profitable in the initial phase, so we attract as many investors as possible, and over time, because of the increased supply of electricity, then we can see prices will start to drop. It will drop naturally. It's just the question of how much investment have you been able to attract, and how efficient are the investors that you've attracted.
Your thoughts on taxes, single digits, what is the answer to raising our taxes? Is it taxing the wealthy, closing loopholes, bringing more into the tax net? How do you see it?
Again, taxes is another topic that we've increasingly turned into a taboo. People don't want to talk about it, but we will. My sense is that when you see a property that has a commercial value of $1 million and the resident is paying $200 equivalent in land use charge, you know there is a problem, just a fact. And at that level of taxation, and that's one example, you are unlikely to raise a reasonable amount of revenue to provide the infrastructure that is required, even for that single resident to be able to enjoy the space that they occupy. But of course, it's a double-edged thing, because nobody should have to provide a borehole, for instance, in their homes. Nobody should have a micro power station or a small security outfit just to be able to live in a city. So yes, I do believe that we significantly need to improve the amount of taxes that gets to government. A lot of that is going to come from people who earn quite a reasonable amount of money and today do not pay enough taxes, in my view. But it's also going to come from increasing more people. A lot of the informal economy can potentially contribute to the net tax generated. But to do that, for the government to exercise that legitimacy, it must also commit to providing the services that individuals are now required to provide because they don't exist. It must also commit to eliminating the informal taxes that meant that people pay, but government doesn't get the money. So it's not a one solution, but I think the starting point, if this was a chicken and egg, the starting point would be for the Nigerians who earn fairly well to accept higher taxation. Again, because nobody really puts in the effort to hold the government accountable if the sources of funding doesn't come from their pocket. So when you have oil revenue funded economies, people tend to spend less time holding government accountable relative to tax funded economies where people haven't paid a reasonable amount of taxes, then find it necessary to put in the effort to demand accountability. So for me, paying higher taxes is actually a guarantee to better quality of government, because no government can get away with collecting higher taxes and not providing higher quality of services.
Thank you so much. So I really wanted to talk to you about debt, but we are out of time. Can you give us in a minute a quick economic outlook for 2023 to close?
I believe that Nigeria 2023 will be a surprise to a lot of people. I think a lot of things are in place. I think despite the global difficulties that we face, Nigeria has crawled through a lot of difficulties. We are a very resilient economy, and all it takes is a little bit of optimism and support from government. I would say for 2023 to be the kind of year that is capable of being, government needs to pay more attention to employers of labor across the country. Not just the SMEs, even the large corporations. Anyone that can help increase employment in this country today should be treated with decency, with support, so that we can cut down on unemployment and grow this economy. Nigeria can easily grow above 5% in 2023 if the politics does not distort our commitment.
Thank you, sir. And in fact, I think Sterling Bank, congrats to you. You won an award recently for one of the best places to work in Nigeria. Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, CEO, Sterling Bank, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, sir.